Life of David Livingston, Part 53. The Last Journey and Death of Livingston. It'll be recollected that Stanley bade Dr. Livingston farewell on the 14th of March, 1872, at Kualahara, and that on his arrival at Zanzibar, he sent back to Dr. Livingston the men and means he had expressed a wish for. For some unexplained cause, this party of recruits with their stores was exceedingly slow in reaching Dr. Livingston. According to the account given by Mr. Stanley by Dr. Livingston's body servant, Jacob Wainwright, after the funeral in London, Dr. Livingston expressed great joy when he at last saw the caravan of freemen for which he had been so anxiously waiting before the resumption of the explorations. After allowing them a few days of rest at Uniyembe, Dr. Livingston and his party started on this last exploring journey. They traveled southward to southwest by way of Kanzagaria and Kandu and Kisiera, the district ruled by King Simba, and here the doctor had a relapse of his old malady, the chronic dysentery, which so weakened him that he was compelled to take to riding a donkey. He did not yet regard the attack as dangerous, and accordingly pursued his march still southwestward to Mufapwa, and thence into the valley of the Ruwanga, where he found many boiling springs. Thence he passed through the Uwipia and Yemba, or to Maragunga in the marshes of Yembamba. One of the two of his donkeys died. Traveling along the Morongo, they reached the district called Kawalendi, where a lion killed the remaining donkey. Thenceforward, the doctor, getting daily weaker, had to be borne in a native bed resembling a hammock. He still refused to yield, but urged his party on to still until they came to a headwater which emptied itself into Lake Bangawelio. Here they made use of Stanley's boat, which was carried a distance of 1,100 miles. They crossed the Chambenzi and attempted to push their way along the southern shore of Lake Banju toward the fountains of Herodotus, reported to be at Katanega, where he hoped to pause and recruit his health. Perceiving, however, how rapidly he was growing weaker, he determined to hasten back to Uniyembe, and accordingly at last turned his face northwards. But on arriving at Kitayembo, he seemed suddenly to realize that he was in his last hour and was drawing near. And he tried to stop there, and but the chief refused to permit it, and he was forced to proceed further down towards Kibende. On their arrival at a small village in the district of Mulala, his tent was pitched, and he was placed therein, but fearing the heat of the sun, he directed that a hut should be built for him to die in. This was done, and he was carefully removed to it. His last entry in his diary is dated April 27, 1873. 13 days after his parting from Mr. Stanley, and in that entry he records his extreme illness and inability to proceed further. After this, he seems to have resolutely prepared for the great journey of death. The boy, Majawara, states that during the intervals between the paroxysms of extreme pain, the doctor prayed constantly for his family and frequently uttered the word home. After his being placed in his hut, Dr. Livingston would permit no one to stay with him except Majawara, and occasionally Susie, though the rest each morning called and greeted him with the customary words, Yambo Bana, which means good morning, master. Majwara, on the last morning, made some tea for the doctor and administered some stimulants, which appeared to have no effect. At about midnight, May 1st, Dr. Livingston quietly breathed his last. The next morning, the faithful attendants held a consultation as to what was to be done with the remains. Their movements had to be kept very secret because if the fact of his death was discovered by the natives, there was reason for fear that their superstitions would lead them to prevent the removal of the corpse. Fargala, one of the men sent by Mr. Stanley, then disemboweled the body, and after leaving the village a safe distance, they hung it in the sun for 5 days to dry it thoroughly, after which they packed it carefully in bark. Jeez. These steps were taken with the view the better to carry it out their These steps were taken with the view the better to carry out their determination of sending the body home to England. After the heart and intestines had been carefully removed, a solemn funeral service was held, and they were committed to the earth, Jacob Wainwright officiating as leader of the religious ceremonies. They then set out on a long journey to Yuyembe, in a journey which constituted 6 weary months, owing to repeated attempts of natives to bar their march, which necessitated much loss of time in pursuing circuitous routes. Meanwhile, the 4th search and relief expedition arrived at Zanzibar in February 1873. This expedition was under the leadership of the Lieutenants Murphy and Cameron and Dr. Dillon, and had been sent out by the Royal Geographical Society. Sir Bartel Ferrere was then at Zanzibar endeavoring to forward the efforts of the government to suppress the slave trade in response to the earnest representations of Dr. Livingston. He rendered the expedition such aid as he could, and it proceeded to Yuyembe, where it arrived in August. In October, a messenger brought in the sad news of Dr. Livingston's death. Dr. Dillonson, who was sick with Lieutenant Murphy soon after soon after started to return from their expedition, but at Kiligara, Dr. Dillon, under the temporary attack of insanity, committed suicide. Leaving to the ensuing chapter the notes of the homeward voyage of the party who bore Dr. Livingston's remains to England, we cannot better close this chapter than by copying an interesting letter from Mr. Holmwood, the British Vice Consul at Zanzibar, to Sir Bartel Ferrer, then the President of the Royal Geographical Society. When we have already given the substance of the information as detailed by Jacob Wainwright, but the letter is interesting enough to justify its insertion, notwithstanding the repetitions and occasional apparent discrepancies. Zanzibar, March 12, 1874. My dear Sir Bartle, no doubt you will hear from several interested in Dr. Livingston, but as I do not feel sure that anyone has thoroughly examined the men who came down with his remains, I briefly summarize what I have been able to glean from the careful cross-examination of Marjawara, who was always at his side during the last days, and Sutsi, who as well the Nassik boys have generally confirmed what he says. I enclose a small sketch map, merely giving my idea of the locality, and have added a dotted line to show his route during the last journey of his life. The party, sent by Stanley, left Uyembe with the doctor about the end of August 1872 and marched straight to the south of Lake Tanganyika through Upia, crossing the Runganawa River, where they met with natural springs and boiling water bubbling up above the ground. On reaching the Chambezi and Kambanzi River, crossed about a week's journey from Lake Bemba, also crossing a large feeder, but by Sutsi's advice, Livingston again turned northward and across the Kambitsi and Lulampa, as he then called it, just before he entered the lake. He could not, however, keep close to the north shore of Lake Bemba, owing to the numerous creeks and streams which were hidden in forests of high grass and rushes. After making a detour, he again struck the lake at a village where he got canoes across to an island in the center called Matipa. Here the shores on either hand were not visible, and the doctor was put in great straits by the natives, declining to let him use their canoes to cross to the opposite shore. He therefore seized 7 canoes by force, and when the natives made a show of resistance, he fired his pistol over their heads, after which they ceased to obstruct him. Crossing the lake diagonally, he arrived in a long valley, and the rains having now been set fully, the caravan had to wade rather than to walk, constantly crossing blind streams, and in fact, owing to the high rushes and grass, hardly being able to distinguish at times the land, or rather what was generally dry land, from the lake. Dr. Livingston had been weak and ailing since leaving Uyembe, and when passing through the country of Bende, at the southwest of the lake, he told Marjawara that he felt unable to go on with his work and should try to cross the hills to Kantanda and there rest, endeavoring to buy ivory, which in all of this country is very cheap, and returning to Ujiji through another place to recruit and reorganize. But as he approached the northern part of Bisa, arriving in the province of Yalala, he first had to take to riding a donkey and then suffer himself to be carried on a native bedstead, which at first went much against the grain. During this time, he never allowed the boy to leave him, and then told the faithful and honest fellow that he should never cross the high hills to Kandanda. He called for Sutsi and asked how far it was to the Luapala, and on his answering 3 days remarked he should never see his river again. Sad. On arriving at Lala, the capital of the district where Kitchenambo and the Sultan lived, the party were refused permission to stay, and they carried Livingston's 3 hours march back towards Cabanende. Here they erected for him a rude hut and fence, and he would not allow any to approach him for the remaining days of his life except Majawara and Sutsi, except that every morning they were all desired to come to the door and say good morning. During these few days he was in great pain and could keep nothing even for a moment in his stomach. He lost his sight so far as hardly to be able to distinguish when a light was kindled, and gradually sank during the night of the 4th of May, 1873. Only Majawara was present when he died, and he's unable to say when he ceased to breathe. Sutsi, hearing that he was dead, told Jacob Wainwright to make a note in the doctor's diary of the things found by him. Wainwright was not quite certain as to the day of the month, and as Sutsi told the doctor had last written the day before, and he found this entry to be dated 27 April, he wrote 28 April. But on comparing his own diary on arriving at Uniyembe, he found it to be the 4th of May, and this is confirmed by Majawara, who says Livingston was unable to write for the last 4 or 5 days of his life. I fancy the spot where Livingston died is about 11.25 degrees south, 27 degrees east, but of course the whole of this is subject to correction, and although I have spent many hours in finding it all out, the doctor's diary may show it to be very imperfect. I fear you will find this a very unconnected narrative, but my apology must be that the Consul General is not well. and the other assistant absent on duty, and there is much work for me to do. Mr. Arthur Landing, Mr. Arthur Lang has been entrusted with the charge of the remains and diaries, which later he has been instructed to hand to Lord Derby. Trusting that you are in the enjoyment of good health, and with great respect, believe me, dear Sir Bartle, your most obedient servant, Frederick Holmwood. To the right, Geographical Society.